Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute, seemingly impossible physics of the Palm Jumeirah in Dubai. I mean, just imagine wanting to build a giant, sprawling city shaped exactly like a palm tree, right smack in the middle of the sea. That was Dubai's grand dream, right? To drastically extend their coastline so more people could live right there on the crystal clear water. And honestly, can you believe they actually pulled it off? Right now, as we speak, millions of tons of heavy luxury mansions are sitting on an island made entirely out of sand and rock. But logically, you'd think one bad storm or a single underwater earthquake would turn this entire mega project right back into a muddy ocean floor in minutes. So why exactly isn't the Palm Jumeirah sinking? How in the world did they turn loose ocean sand into an absolute fortress? Let's get into it.
Okay, so usually when you build huge structures out on the ocean, you just pour these giant concrete legs deep into the seabed to hold the whole thing up. Pretty standard, right? But for this specific island, the engineers were handed this strict, frankly ridiculous rule. Absolutely no concrete foundations allowed for the land itself. None. You have to build it entirely out of natural materials. So if you can't use concrete, how do you actually get enough stable land to build a literal city? Well, you need sand. An unbelievable amount of sand.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Dubai is quite literally surrounded by endless desert, so why not just scoop all that up and dump it into the water? Well, here's the thing. Desert sand is super smooth and perfectly round from centuries of blowing around in the wind. It's exactly like millions of tiny glass marbles, and if you throw a bunch of marbles into the ocean, they just slide all over the place and refuse to stick together. The currents would just wash it all away instantly. So engineers had to send these massive ships way out into the deep ocean to dredge up rough, jagged sea sand directly from the seafloor. They brought it back and just blasted it into the water like gigantic water guns, slowly building up a literal mountain out of the sea.
Awesome, so they've got their sea sand. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. They almost immediately ran into what's known as the water balloon effect. When sand gets completely soaked, it basically acts like a liquid. If you try to build heavy hotels and paved roads on top of that wet, loose sand, the sheer weight of the buildings just squeezes the water trapped between the grains, pushing the sand completely apart. The second a heavy truck drives over it, the whole island would just swallow it up like quicksand. The island at this stage was basically a colossal water balloon, just waiting to burst under its own weight.
But before they could even begin to figure out that squishy sand problem, a much scarier, immediate threat was literally rolling in. Big, violent waves from the open ocean were already crashing down, threatening to completely wash away their delicate little sand mountain before they could even try to pack it down. Their absolute first mission was to stop those waves cold. They needed to build a giant shield, an 11-kilometer-long breakwater ring that would completely encircle the island and keep the water inside as totally calm as a backyard swimming pool.
Building a concrete-free wall of that size in the middle of the sea meant they needed rocks, giant, heavy rocks. Endless lines of trucks carried millions of tons of solid mountain rock to the coast, and ships literally just dropped them straight down into the water. But it wasn't random. They built this wall in very specific, calculated layers. First, they laid down this highly permeable geotextile fabric. Then came smaller stones at the bottom, medium rocks in the middle, and finally they stacked these massive boulders on the outside edge facing the open ocean. And guys, these weren't just big pebbles. We're talking rocks where each individual boulder weighed more than an actual elephant.
And the design here is just brilliant. Instead of trying to fight the ocean with brute force, where a wave hitting a flat, solid wall acts like a massive hammer blow that eventually just shatters it, they designed this shield to trap and trick the water. The sloped angle of the rocks literally forces a crashing wave to roll upward, lose all its speed, and spill harmlessly backward, kind of like a bathtub overflow. Plus, those giant boulders, they weren't glued together at all. The tiny gaps between them purposely trap the rushing water, completely draining away its violent pressure. And remember that special fabric at the bottom? It lets water flow freely through it, but keeps every single tiny grain of sand permanently trapped beneath the heavy rocks, meaning the shield never, ever sinks. It's just pure engineering genius.
Okay, so with that giant shield finally in place, the water inside was nice and calm. But that immediately brought them to the next unbelievable puzzle. How on earth do you draw a giant, perfectly shaped palm tree in the middle of the ocean without making a single mistake? Think about it. Standing on a ship out there, all you see is featureless blue water in every single direction. You definitely can't just stick wooden poles or measuring tapes into deep ocean water. If one of those dredger ships sprayed sand even a few meters off target, the famous iconic palm fronds would end up looking lumpy, crooked, or just completely ruined.
They basically needed a giant ruler in the sky. Now, back when this was built, standard GPS could easily be off by a few meters, which would have been a total disaster for this highly delicate shape. So the engineers went ahead and built a custom high-tech tracking system. Private space satellites locked onto the exact coordinates, while a special radio tower back on land corrected the signal every few seconds to guarantee millimeter accuracy. They wired this system directly into the ship's control rooms. The computer guided the ship's captain across the water almost exactly like a video game, telling them exactly when to pull the trigger to start and stop spraying the sand. The result? A flawlessly drawn giant palm tree that's visibly perfect even to astronauts looking down from the International Space Station. Crazy, right?
All right, let's pivot back to that super dangerous soft sand issue. The palm tree shape was finally floating there in the water, but it was still totally soft and unstable. Think of all that unpacked sand exactly like a freshly poured box of dry cereal. When you first pour it out, there are tons of empty air pockets all throughout it, making it take up way too much space. But if you tap or shake the box gently, the pieces settle down tightly into all those gaps. The loose sand underwater had dangerous air and water gaps exactly like that cereal. The engineers knew they desperately needed to settle the sand tightly together so those massive luxury mansions wouldn't just immediately sink into the earth. But here is the multi-billion-dollar question. How in the world do you physically shake an entire island?
Enter a radical, heavy-duty technique called vibroflotation. I want you to picture a metal pole as long as a 5-story building that vibrates at insanely high speeds. It's basically a colossal electric toothbrush. Massive crane ships and trucks plunged these huge shaking poles all the way down through the sand to the solid ocean floor. As this giant pole vibrated deep underwater, it sent out these powerful force waves through the sand, while at the exact same time shooting high-pressure water jets out of its tip. This intense, violent shaking essentially forced all that trapped water to shoot straight up to the surface. It's a wildly effective method that completely revolutionized how we tackle marine land-building projects all over the world today.
So once that trapped water wasn't holding the grains apart anymore, the rough, sharp sea sand just collapsed in on itself. It locked together super tightly, almost like microscopic puzzle pieces. In fact, as the sand packed down, the actual ground level of the island physically dropped because all that empty space was just gone. They literally had to repeat this process day and night, poking tens of thousands of deep holes across every single front of the palm. But it worked. After months of non-stop shaking, the muddy sea sand transformed into a tightly locked layer that was as solid as concrete. The island could finally support fully loaded trucks without moving a single millimeter.
But as is the nature of massive engineering projects, solving one huge problem immediately created another one. A new, completely invisible, and incredibly gross danger popped up: stagnant water. Because that massive 11-kilometer rock wall completely blocked off the palm tree from the open ocean, the seawater trapped inside the fronds just stopped moving. Now imagine leaving salt water sitting totally still under the burning desert sun with absolutely no water filter. Yeah, within weeks it loses all its oxygen and turns into a smelly, gross green swamp. Algae takes over, fish die, and it reeks. And obviously absolutely no one is going to buy a multi-million-dollar luxury mansion next to a foul-smelling swamp. So that water desperately needed to move continuously to stay crystal clear. Their solution? The engineers quite literally cut 2 giant slits directly through the outer crescent of that huge rock breakwater, basically opening 2 secret back doors. Now, to stop those violent storm waves from just rushing straight through the new gaps and tearing up the island, they built these incredibly clever underwater bridges right at the openings. When a massive storm wave hits the gap, the underwater bridge forces the wave to break early and lose all its destructive energy. But the normal, gentle movement of the daily tide, it just easily flows right over the top of the bridge. This genius natural water pump naturally flushes out and completely replaces all the water around the entire palm tree every single 13 days.
Okay, so the water is completely clean, the sand is packed tight, we're totally in the clear, right? Actually, no. One truly terrifying threat remained lurking right beneath the surface. You see, the Persian Gulf sits precariously close to active tectonic fault lines. And if an earthquake strikes an island made entirely out of wet sand, you get a terrifying phenomenon called soil liquefaction. It's a massive threat to coastal real estate everywhere, not just in Dubai. When an earthquake hits, that sudden, violent shaking violently squeezes the tiny spaces between the sand grains, forcing underground water upward under immense pressure. Within seconds, what felt like solid ground instantly turns into a watery soup. It's a total liquid trap. If this happened to the Palm Jumeirah, those massive high-rise towers would tilt, the roads would split wide open, and the entire island would literally slide right back into the ocean.
So how do you protect against a literal liquid trap when you're banned from using traditional concrete foundations? Well, they threw out the high-tech gadgets and deployed a brutal but absolutely vital technique called deep dynamic compaction. This was just pure mechanical violence. Before laying down a single brick, they brought in giant cranes to lift these absolutely massive steel weights, some weighing up to 40 tons, high up into the air and just drop them directly onto the sand. Boom. Over and over and over again. This intense, impossibly heavy pounding squeezed out absolutely any remaining microscopic pockets of water and air, bonding those grains so unbelievably tight that water simply could no longer force its way between them, not even during a massive seismic shock.
So, against all odds, that loose ocean sand was effectively transformed into an indestructible fortress, capable of surviving rogue waves, stagnant water, and literal tectonic threats. But here's the thing about living on top of the sea. It means you are locked into a continuous, high-stakes game against nature. Because no matter how solid you pack that ground, the ocean never, ever truly rests. Mother Nature's natural water currents and strong winds are constantly chewing at the coastline, slowly dragging that hard-won sand right back into the deep water. To stop the island from literally shrinking, specialized maintenance ships have to endlessly dredge fresh sand from the seafloor and constantly spray it right back onto the shores. It is a literal, endless, relentless battle of maintenance to keep this artificial coastline intact. And as global climate change accelerates, an even bigger challenge is looming on the horizon. The Palm Jumeirah sits just a few meters above the current waterline, so rising sea levels and more aggressive storms are placing immense, growing pressure on that outer breakwater wall, directly threatening all those beautiful, low-lying mansions.
90 million. That is the staggering amount of cubic meters of loose sea sand engineers had to turn over to build this thing. The Palm Jumeirah stands today as a frankly audacious engineering triumph. Engineers literally grabbed 90 million cubic meters of sand alongside 7 million tons of rock and forged it into a thriving, world-famous city. They absolutely proved that with some very clever physics, satellite guidance, and intense vibration, humanity really could build a stable paradise right on top of the ocean without using a single drop of concrete for the land itself. Mathematically, it is just staggering.
The entire story of Palm Jumeirah proves that human ingenuity can accomplish things that seem totally impossible on paper. But, it also leaves us with a pretty humbling reminder. We never truly conquer the ocean. We merely borrow space from it. As climate change accelerates and the tides continue to rise, it really forces us to ask the ultimate question. Exactly how much further can we push the boundaries of nature before the ocean decides it wants its space back? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.